Gunslinger buried his enemy, then discovered the widow was carrying his child. He buried the man he'd hunted for 3 years, and then knocked on the door to tell the dead man's wife she was now a widow. The dirt under Jack Brennan's fingernails was still wet when he heard the baby cry. He froze, hands halfway to his horse's reins, the sound cutting through the evening air like a blade through leather. From the small cabin below Calvary Ridge, yellow lamplights spilled across weathered boards, and somewhere inside those walls, life continued on, unaware that death had just finished its work 100 yards away. The grave behind him was rough, hastily dug in rocky ground that fought every shovelful. Samuel Kane lay beneath 6 feet of red dirt and stone, his gun belt coiled neat beside him, his hat placed careful over the face that would never see another sunrise. 3 years Brennan had tracked him. 3 years of following rumors and cold trails, sleeping under stars that offered no comfort, eating dust and drinking regret. 3 years to balance the scales for Tommy. But now, standing in the fading light with dirt caked under his nails and his brother's blood finally avenged, Jack Brennan felt no peace, only the weight of what came next. The baby cried again, followed by a woman's soft voice, singing low and sweet. The melody drifted through the evening like smoke, carrying words he couldn't make out but understood all the same. It was the sound of someone trying to keep the darkness at bay with nothing but her own voice and whatever love she had left to give. Brennan's horse nickered, eager to be moving. They could ride out now, disappear into the vastness of the territory before anyone knew Samuel Kane was dead, before anyone came looking, before questions needed answering. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But Tommy had been 17 when Kane put 2 bullets in his chest over a poker game gone wrong. 17, with their mother's eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. And when Tommy died in Brennan's arms on the floor of that saloon in Abilene, he'd made a promise. Not just to kill the man who'd taken his brother, but to see it done proper, to face whatever came after. The woman's singing stopped. A door creaked open. "Samuel? That you out there?" Her voice carried hope like a cup carries water, careful, precious, easy to spill. Brennan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his Colt against his hip, the weight of 3 years of hunting, the weight of promises made to the dead. When he opened them again, he could see her silhouette in the doorway, one hand on her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes against the dying light. Elena Kane was younger than he'd expected. Maybe 25, with dark hair that caught the lamplight and skin that spoke of Mexican blood mixed with something else. Irish, maybe, or German. She wore a simple dress, blue cotton faded to the color of winter sky. And when she stepped onto the porch, Brennan could see the careful way she moved, protecting the life she carried inside. "Evening, ma'am." His voice came out rough, and used to gentleness after years of hard traveling. "I'm afraid I got some news about your husband." She went still, hand pressing flat against her belly. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Elena Kane didn't speak, but Brennan saw her shoulders set themselves straight, preparing for whatever blow was coming. "He's dead, ma'am. I am sorry." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Elena Kane's face didn't change, not right away. She looked at him, then past him toward the ridge where her husband lay buried, then back to his face. Brennan had delivered death before, but never like this. Never to someone carrying new life. Never to someone whose only crime was loving the wrong man. "How?" she asked, and her voice stayed steady. "Fair fight." He drew first. It was the truth, though not all of it. Kane had drawn first because he'd known what was coming. Had seen it in Brennan's eyes the moment he'd walked into that cantina in Socorro. Had known that 3 years of running was finally over. Elena nodded, still touching her belly. "You bury him proper?" "Yes, ma'am. Up on the ridge there." Mark the spot. She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the darkening hills. Somewhere inside the cabin, the baby began to fuss again. Not crying now, just making the small sounds babies make when they're hungry or lonesome. "That's my sister's boy," Elena said, following his gaze toward the door. "Maria died birthing him." Samuel, and I've been raising him. She paused, her hand moving in small circles on her dress. This one's due come winter. The mathematics of it hit Brennan like a physical blow. A widow with a baby that wasn't hers. Another one coming, winter approaching, and no man to see them through. In this country, that was a death sentence stretched out over months instead of minutes. "Ma'am, you got somewhere to be?" she asked, cutting him off. Her eyes met his for the first time, and Brennan saw something there he hadn't expected. Not hatred, not fear, but a kind of tired understanding. Like she'd been waiting for this moment longer than she cared to admit. "No, ma'am. Nowhere special." Elena Kane nodded once, then turned toward her door. "Well then," she said, her voice carrying something that might have been invitation or might have been resignation. "I suppose you better come inside. Tell me how my husband died, and then we'll figure out what comes after." The lamplight spilled golden across her face as she waited, and Jack Brennan realized that killing Samuel Kane had been the easy part. What came next? Living with what he'd done, facing the woman whose life he'd shattered. That was going to be the hardest thing he'd ever done. Behind him, the grave settled into the rocky ground with a sound like settling dust. Ahead, the door stood open, and inside, a baby cried for someone to hold him against the darkness that was coming. Brennan stepped forward, each footfall heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be taken back, and wondered if redemption was something a man could find in the ruins of what he'd destroyed. The widow looked at the man who killed her husband and said the words that would change everything. "I suppose you better stay for supper." Elena Kane's kitchen table had seen better years. The wood was scarred from countless meals, knife marks telling stories of bread sliced thin to make it last, of vegetables chopped careful so nothing went to waste. Two plates sat across from each other, chipped but clean, and between them lay the space where Samuel Kane would never sit again. Brennan kept his hat in his hands, turning the brim slow and steady while Elena moved around the small kitchen. She hadn't spoken much since bringing him inside, just the necessary words, polite and distant as winter stars. The baby, little Miguel, slept in a wooden cradle by the stove, his tiny fist curled against his chest like he was holding on to something precious. "Coffee's weak," Elena said, setting a cup before him. "Been stretching the grounds." "Obedient, Mom." The coffee was more water than bean, but it was warm, and warmth counted for something in this hard country. She sat across from him, her own cup cradled in both hands, and for the first time since he'd knocked on her door, Elena Kane really looked at him. Her eyes moved over his face like she was reading a map, taking in the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the way his shoulders carried themselves like they'd been bearing weight too long. "You don't look like a killer," she said finally. Brennan set down his cup. "What's a killer supposed to look like?" Samuel always said they had dead eyes. Cold, like looking into a well at night. She tilted her head, studying him. "Your eyes aren't dead. They're just tired." The baby stirred in his cradle, making small sounds in his sleep. Elena's hand moved to her belly again, the protective gesture Brennan had noticed on the porch. The child inside kicked, and he saw her wince. "When's it due?" he asked. "December, near as I can figure." She looked down at her hands. "First snow, maybe December. 3 months away, and winter came early to this high country." Brennan had ridden through enough harsh seasons to know what that meant. Wood to cut and stack. Food to preserve. Animals to tend. All the work that kept people alive when the world turned white and unforgiving. "You got help?" "Family nearby." Elena shook her head. "Samuel's people back in Kansas, but they never took to me. Said he married beneath himself." Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat acceptance of someone who'd heard it too many times to let it cut deep anymore. "My family's all gone. Cholera took most, war took the rest." She was alone then, truly alone, in a way that made Brennan's chest tighten. He'd been alone for 3 years, but that was choice. This was different. This was the kind of alone that killed people in country like this. "Ma'am, I know it in my place, but you're right." Elena stood, moving to the window where the last light was fading from the sky. "It's not your place. You killed my husband. You put me and these babies in danger. So no, it's not your place to worry about what happens to us now. The words should have stung, but they didn't. They were true, and truth was something Brennan had learned to carry without flinching. He rose from the table, settling his hat on his head. I'll be moving on then, ma'am. Sorry for your trouble. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. That fence along the south pasture's been down since the spring rains. Stock keeps wandering off. Her voice was quiet, but stopped him cold. And the roof leaks something fierce when the wind's from the north. Samuel kept saying he'd fix it, but Brennan turned back. Elena still faced the window, but her reflection in the glass showed him her face, and what he saw there wasn't anger anymore. It was something harder to bear, desperate hope fighting against bitter experience. I could take a look at them things before I ride out, he said carefully. If you wanted, why would you do that? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Brennan could have told her about guilt, about the weight of what he'd done, about Tommy lying dead in that saloon while his killer walked free for 3 more years. But Elena Kane didn't need his guilt. She needed help, and reasons didn't matter as much as results. Because it needs doing, he said simply. She turned from the window then, and the last light caught her face, showing him something he hadn't expected to see. Not forgiveness, it was too soon for that, but maybe the beginning of it. Like a seed waiting for the right season to grow. There's a lean-to out behind the house, she said. You can bed down there if you've a mind to. I'll have breakfast ready at first light. Miguel woke then, soft crying filling the small kitchen. Elena moved to him with practiced ease, lifting the baby against her shoulder and swaying in that ancient rhythm mothers knew by heart. The child settled against her, and for a moment, the 3 of them existed in a space outside of time. A woman, a baby, and the man who'd made them both orphans. Mom. Brennan's voice was rough with something he couldn't name. What was he like? Your husband. Elena was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she began to rock Miguel, her voice barely above a whisper. He was young when we married. 19, maybe 20. Had big dreams about making something of himself out here. She touched the baby's dark hair with one finger. He wasn't always what he became. The land wore him down, I think. Made him hard. She looked at Brennan then, and her eyes held a question he couldn't quite read. What about you? What made you hard? The answer came without thinking. Watching my brother die for a mistake that wasn't his. Elena nodded, like she'd expected something like that. Samuel never told me about any brother. Wouldn't have mattered to him. Tommy was just in the way of what Samuel wanted. Brennan moved toward the door again, then stopped. For what it's worth, ma'am, he drew fair. I gave him the choice to walk away. But he didn't. No, he didn't. Elena settled into the rocking chair by the stove, Miguel's breathing deep and even against her chest. Samuel never could walk away from a fight. Said it made him look weak. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's what finally killed him. Not your bullet, but his own pride. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the house and whistling through the gaps in the walls. Winter was coming, sure as sunrise, and this place wasn't ready for it. Neither was the woman inside, with her swollen belly and her borrowed baby and her stubborn determination to survive what looked unsurvivable. I'll start on that fence tomorrow, Brennan said. Elena looked up at him, Miguel sleeping peaceful in her arms, and something passed between them. Not understanding, not yet, but maybe the promise of it. Like the first warm day after a long winter, when you could almost believe spring might actually come. Thank you, she said, and the words carried more weight than they should have. Brennan touched his hat brim and stepped out into the gathering dark, leaving behind the warmth of the kitchen for the cold comfort of the lean-to. But as he settled into his bedroll, listening to the wind test the walls of the little house, he found himself thinking not about the grave on the ridge or the 3 years of hunting that had brought him here. Instead, he thought about fences that needed mending and roofs that needed fixing, and a woman who'd looked at her husband's killer and seen not an enemy, but maybe, just maybe, someone who might help her plant seeds in ground too hard for anything to grow. When the blizzard trapped them together, she asked the question that changed everything. Tell me why you really killed my husband. The first blizzard of winter came 3 weeks early. howling down from the mountains like something alive and hungry. Brennan had been splitting wood behind the house when the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of snow and the promise of days trapped indoors. He'd learned to read weather in his years of tracking, learned that survival meant watching the sky like other men watch their enemies. Storm's coming. He called through the kitchen window, where Elena stood washing dishes, her belly now so round she had to lean back from the basin. Bad one by the feel of it. She dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, one hand braced against her back. The wind whipped her dark hair across her face, and she had to squint against the first stinging snowflakes. "How long?" she asked. Brennan tested the wind again, feeling its teeth. 3 days, maybe 4. Could be more. Elena nodded, already moving with the efficiency of someone who'd survived frontier winters before. "Help me get Miguel's cradle moved closer to the stove. And bring in all the wood you can carry. We'll need to keep the fire burning steady." By nightfall, the world outside had disappeared behind a wall of white. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind shook the little house like a child with a toy. Inside, the kitchen glowed warm with firelight, and Elena sat in her rocking chair, nursing Miguel while her own child kicked restless inside her. Brennan sat at the table, cleaning his Colt by lamplight. Not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands needed something to do. 3 weeks of living in the lean-to, 3 weeks of mending fences and patching roof leaks and chopping wood, and still the space between them felt fragile as thin ice. "You don't have to do that," Elena said, watching him oil the cylinder. "Clean your gun, I mean. Not like there's anyone out there in this weather." "Habit," Brennan said, not looking up. "Man gets careless with his weapon. He don't usually get a second chance to regret it." "Is that what you told my husband? Before you killed him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Brennan's hands stilled on the gun, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the wind outside and Miguel's soft breathing. "No, ma'am. I told him he could walk away. But you knew he wouldn't." Brennan set down the cloth, finally meeting her eyes across the small room. "I knew." Elena shifted Miguel to her other arm, her movements careful and practiced. "Why? What did Samuel do that was worth 3 years of hunting?" The story came out slow, pulled from him like splinters from deep wood. He told her about Tommy, 17 years old, quick to laugh, slow to anger. About the poker game in Abilene. About Samuel Kane's temper when he thought he was being cheated. About Tommy trying to keep the peace and catching 2 bullets for his trouble. "He died in my arms," Brennan said, his voice barely audible over the storm. Last thing he said was, "Don't let Ma know it hurt." Elena was quiet for a long time, rocking Miguel in the chair their shared warmth had made sacred. Outside, the wind screamed like all the ghosts of winter, but inside, there was only the soft crackle of burning wood and the weight of truth between them. "Samuel never told me about any boy," she said finally. "When I asked about his time in Kansas, he'd just say he'd had to leave some trouble behind. That trouble was my brother's blood. And now Samuel's blood is on your hands." Elena looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Does it balance? Does Tommy rest easier now?" The question hit harder than any accusation could have. Brennan had asked himself the same thing every night for 3 weeks, lying in the lean-to and listening to the sounds of the house settling around the woman and children he'd orphaned. "No," he said, "it don't balance nothing. Tommy's still dead, your husband's still dead, and you're still here carrying a baby with winter coming and no husband to see you through it. Then why?" Elena's voice carried something that might have been anger or might have been grief. "If killing Samuel didn't bring Tommy back, if it didn't make anything right, then why did you do it?" Brennan looked down at his hands, scarred, weathered, stained with more than just gun oil. "Because I promised, and because I was angry, and because—" He stopped, struggling with words that felt too big for his mouth. "Because it was easier than figuring out how to live with what happened." Elena nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. Maybe living with Samuel Kane had taught her something about men who chose violence over the harder work of healing. Miguel fussed in her arms, and she stood to walk him around the small kitchen, swaying in that ancient rhythm. But as she moved, Brennan saw her face tighten, saw her hand press against her back. "Mom? You all right?" Elena stopped walking, one hand gripping the back of a chair. "I think." She breathed deep, slow. "I think it's time." The words hit Brennan like a physical blow. "Time? But you said December. It's barely November. Babies come when they come," Elena said, her voice tight with the effort of staying calm. "And this one's been restless all day." Another wave of pain crossed her face, and she gripped the chair harder. Could be false labor, but as if to prove her wrong, her water broke, spreading across the kitchen floor in a dark stain that reflected the firelight. Elena looked down at it, then up at Brennan, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw real fear in her eyes. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. Outside, the storm raged with a fury that seemed personal, as if winter itself had chosen this moment to test them. Inside, a woman was about to give birth with only her husband's killer to help her, and a man who'd spent 3 years dealing death was about to learn what it meant to bring life into the world. Brennan set his gun on the table and moved toward her, his hands already reaching out despite having no idea what to do with them. "Tell me what you need," he said. Elena gripped his arm as another contraction took her, her fingers digging in like she was drowning, and he was the only rope. "Hot water," she gasped. "Clean cloths. And pray this baby knows what it's doing, because I sure don't." As Brennan helped her toward the bedroom, Miguel crying in his abandoned cradle and the storm shaking the walls around them, he realized that everything he'd thought he understood about himself was about to change. 3 years of hunting, of killing, of choosing violence over peace, all of it had led to this moment, in this storm, with this woman who trusted him with the most precious thing she had to give. The wind howled like all the voices of the dead, and somewhere in that sound, Brennan thought he heard his brother's voice, not angry or accusing, but gentle as Tommy had been in life. And maybe, just maybe, whispering something that sounded like forgiveness. He'd spent 3 years learning how to take a life, but in one night, a woman and her newborn taught him how to save one. Spring came to Calvary Ridge like forgiveness, slow, uncertain, but impossible to deny. Jack Brennan sat on the porch Elena had asked him to rebuild, watching the valley turn green below them. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he didn't mind. These quiet mornings had become sacred to him. These moments before the day demanded its due, when the world belonged to nothing but possibility and the soft sounds of life stirring inside the house behind him. Through the open window, he could hear Elena humming as she moved around the kitchen, the same melody she'd sung that first night when he'd stood over Samuel's grave with dirt under his fingernails. But now the song carried different weight. Not the desperate hope of someone trying to hold darkness at bay, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd found peace in unexpected places. "Coffee's getting cold," Elena said, stepping onto the porch with baby Grace sleeping against her shoulder. "I noticed." Brennan set down the cup and made room on the step beside him. Elena settled there carefully, still moving with the cautious grace of someone whose body had recently done the impossible work of bringing life into the world. Grace had been born just as the storm reached its worst fury, her first cry somehow audible over the wind that tried to tear the roof from their heads. Brennan's hands that had known nothing but violence for 3 years, had caught her as she entered the world, had cleared her airway when she struggled to breathe, had wrapped her in clean cloth while Elena wept with relief and exhaustion. In that moment, kneeling beside the bed with a newborn baby in his arms, Brennan had felt something break open inside his chest. Not breaking like destruction, but like dawn breaking over mountains, like ice breaking up in a spring river. Like the first breath after holding it too long. "She looks like you," he said now, watching Grace's tiny hand curl around Elena's finger. "She has Samuel's chin." Elena touched the baby's face with infinite gentleness. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. He wasn't always what he became at the end. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the morning light move across the valley. In the distance, Brennan could see the cattle he'd helped Elena sell to the passing drovers. Not all of them, but enough to see her through another year. The fence he'd mended held strong, and the garden Elena had planted was already showing green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Miguel toddled out onto the porch, his chubby legs still uncertain but determined. At nearly 2 years old, he learned to call Brennan Papa Jack, a name that had stopped him cold the first time he'd heard it. Now it felt as natural as breathing, as right as rain after drought. Papa Jack up. Miguel reached his arms toward Brennan, who lifted the boy onto his lap with practiced ease. "Morning, little man. You sleep good?" Miguel nodded solemnly, then pointed toward the ridge where his uncle lay buried. They put a proper headstone there now, carved with Samuel Kane's name and the words beloved husband and brother. Elena had insisted on the stone, paid for with money from the cattle sale. "Uncle Samuel's still sleeping," Miguel announced, as if this were important news. "Yes, he is," Elena said softly. "But we're awake, and that means we got work to do." It was true. Spring meant planting, meant birthing season for what stock they'd kept, meant repairs to everything winter had damaged. But it was good work, the kind that built rather than destroyed, that left the world a little better than it had been. Brennan had hung his gun belt on a peg inside the house 3 months ago, and dust had settled on the leather like a blessing. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind was just right, he'd think he heard his brother's voice carried on the air. Not angry anymore, not demanding vengeance, but speaking the words Tommy had never gotten to say. Words about moving forward, about choosing life over death, about the courage it took to plant seeds in ground that had known too much blood. "Jack!" Elena's voice pulled him back to the present. She was looking at him with those dark eyes that had learned to hold trust the way her hands held her baby's, carefully, but without reservation. "There's something I need to ask you." He waited, Miguel warm and heavy in his lap, Grace sleeping peaceful in her mother's arms. "That preacher who comes through every few months, Father Martinez. He'll be here again come summer." Elena's cheeks carried a flush of color that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "I was thinking, if you were minded to stay, we could ask him to say some words over us. Make it proper, I mean." The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and full of possibility. Brennan looked out over the valley, over the land he'd helped heal, over the life they'd built together from the ashes of violence and loss. 6 months ago, he'd been a man with nothing but revenge in his heart and blood on his hands. 6 months ago, he'd stood over Samuel Kane's grave thinking justice had been served, not knowing that real justice looked like this. Like a woman who'd chosen to love her husband's killer, like children who called him father, like mornings that tasted of coffee and forgiveness. "Elena." Her name felt like prayer on his tongue. "Are you sure? I killed your husband." "Some folks might say some folks don't live here," Elena said firmly. "Some folks didn't hold my hand while Grace was being born. Some folks don't get up before dawn to tend our animals, don't sit with Miguel when he has nightmares, don't—" She paused, her voice growing soft. "Don't love us the way you do. Love." The words settled between them like snow on quiet ground, covering everything with something clean and new. Brennan had thought he'd forgotten how to love anything but anger, but Elena and her children had taught him different. Had shown him that love wasn't something you lost, but something you chose again and again in 1,000 small acts of tenderness. "Yes," he said, and the word came out rough with feeling. "Yes, I'd be honored." Elena smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, bright enough to shame the morning sun. She leaned against his shoulder, Grace sleeping between them, Miguel's head growing heavy against Brennan's chest. In the garden beyond the porch, the seeds Elena had planted with his help were pushing through the soil, reaching toward light. The ridge where Samuel Kane lay buried was covered now with wild flowers, purple and yellow and white, nature's own kind of forgiveness growing over the past. Brennan closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of his new life. Elena's quiet breathing, the baby's soft sighs, Miguel's whispered counting as he practiced his numbers. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called its liquid song, and the wind through the new grass sounded like his brother's laughter, finally free of anger, finally at peace. He'd spent 3 years learning how to kill, but a woman and her children had taught him something far more difficult and infinitely more valuable. They taught him how to live, how to love, how to plant seeds in hard ground and trust them to grow. When summer came and Father Martinez rode up to their door, Brennan would stand beside Elena in his best shirt, his hands clean of everything but honest work, and speak vows that meant more than any promise he'd ever made. They would be a family then, not bound by blood or circumstance, but by choice, by the daily decision to build something beautiful from the ruins of what had come before. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces, and Elena began to hum again. Not the desperate song of someone holding off darkness, but the contented melody of someone who'd found light in the most unlikely place. Brennan joined his voice to hers, harmony growing between them like everything else they'd learned to cultivate together. On the ridge above them, the flowers swayed in the morning breeze, and the dust of 3 hard years finally, completely, settled into peace.